Well, anyway, this talk will be pretty much a talk. I have some notes, and I made an outline because they asked me to give you an abstract, and I'll be pretty much just running down that actually with you, with some comments about various points on it. This will not be one of those talks where first I tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. That's not the pattern of this at all. Don't expect it for better or for worse. I've always taken not the rifle approach, but sort of the blunderbuss approach in everything I do, and I'm afraid this talk will demonstrate that. Some comments first about myself in the way of prologue. I am a sociologist. This has a terrific advantage. I have no vested interest really in the outcome. I mean, in my role as scientist, I don't care where the chips fall. I'm studying you in a sense rather than the data in many ways. And so therefore, I think I have a distinct advantage over many people who dabble in this area scientifically. In terms of my personal history, I come from a very deviant subcultural background of the circus. I've been exposed to all kinds of enormously extraordinary human activities since I was a small child. Many things that people think are phony, like sword swallowing and many other things, I've known from childhood that they're not. On the other hand, I haven't necessarily seen them as miraculous. I've just seen them as very clever or something of that sort. But in a way, if you want to call it a cynicism, it doesn't come from scoffing at these things. It comes from having been immersed in a culture as a child, particularly, of people doing many phony things and so on. And I just sort of take that as part of life. That's all. It's not that I condemn it particularly. I just expect people to be self-deceived, and I expect people to deceive other people, and so on. So I just try to make no judgments about it as much as I can, anyway. Because of my involvement in deviant belief systems, most of which started with work on the sociology of religion, because I did a lot of work on pagan groups and satanic groups and things of that sort, I almost immediately found that more and more people in the so-called occult world, the magical world, were justifying what was going on in terms of parapsychological or some sort of scientific claims. I mean, there were very few people who said they talked to the devil last night or to an angel. Most of them were talking in terms of look at the data from Dr. Ryan or those kinds of comments. So I quickly realized I better get back into the areas of psychical research. I had an earlier interest in this because of my magical background, that is to say my conjuring stage magical background that I sort of grew up with. And so I got very involved with that, and I helped, unfortunately, perhaps to found the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal and edited their journal for a couple of years, but then I found that I was almost at complete odds with everybody else, almost everybody else on the executive board. I'll explain a little bit more about that, and so I left the committee and started my own Center for Scientific Anomalies Research and my own journal called Synthetic Scholar. Now, the more I get into all of these areas on all sides of the fence, it's been actually a wonderful thing for me, because when I left the enemy in the minds of so many proponents of the paranormal, I all of a sudden found all kinds of new friends. I'm one of those few people that is just sociologically positioned in the middle, in the sense that I have lots of very close friends on both ends, even extreme ends of the spectrum. And in that sense, it's been very useful to me as a sociologist, and really more as a human being, because sociology is just an excuse to do what I like to do anyway. I don't pretend to be that totally objective about everything I do. In any case, as I look into this area, one of the great problems I found is that most of the people in it are talking past one another, even within the proponent camp, even within the critical camp. There's an enormous ignorance of relevant, specialized literature in the areas. I've gotten recently involved with a number of groups that talk about intuition, and none of them seem to know anything about the psychological literature on intuition that already exists, that sort of thing. I mean, there's a long history of so many of these areas, and people just have engaged in what Pitirim Sorokin, one of my heroes, called the Columbus complex. They all think they're discovering America for the first time. And to make it worse, they come up with all kinds of new terminology. And then one of the questions, I think, for anyone who's serious, like I try to be serious in this area, is to analyze the terms and recognize the incredible multidimensionality of almost every concept that tends to be used in this area. In other words, the more I look, the more complex everything really becomes on both sides of the spectrum. And I think this is a remarkable thing. have engaged in a kind of dichotomous thinking so much, sort of with this or against this kind of viewpoints on both sides of the spectrum. And what has actually made it much worse is that as the proponent organizations start forming, in a sense you're a proponent sub-organization, I guess, in parapsychology, and as the critics develop into skeptical organizations, what happens is greater polarization takes place. Each group sort of reinforces itself and its members, and you end up with essentially true believers and true disbelievers at the extremes. And it's horrible because there's less communication now, I think, than there was before the organizations formed, when you could at least sort of fish in both streams. Now it's really rather sad, I think, in terms of what's happened. Sort of everybody's preaching to the choir, as they say, on both sides. Now on the proponent side, which I prefer to use words like proponent and critic to talk about anomaly claims like psi and other things. The proponent side, we have all these wonderful words. You know, we started out with sixth sense, gut feelings, then ESP, of course, and then we got psi. Now we're back to intuition, which is a much more neutral word, which doesn't sound quite so theory-laden. Now we have anomalous cognition, although I've never really understood the difference between anomalous perception, which is ESP, and anomalous cognition, which seems to avoid the question of anything perceiving anything. So I'm not quite sure, you know, what we mean by a lot of these terms, and all these words get jumbled together, and of course remote viewing is one of these newer terms, and it's very hard to know what the hell people are talking about. Because half of you, when I talk to you, that I have those of you to whom I've talked, remote viewing equals clairvoyance, equals intuition, equals, you know, they're all sort of the same thing, really. And then one wonders, you know, what's the new brand name this month, you know? And that's not as funny as it sounds, because trademarks and patents and things of that kind are part of the business here. I mean, there are entrepreneurs in this area, and one of the names of the game is to own it. And so we have technical remote viewing and controlled remote viewing and regular remote viewing and Swan's remote viewing. You know, so which one, who owns what, you know? So lots of issues on that side. On the critic side, we have a complete ignorance of basic questions like, you know, what do we mean by evidence? What do we mean by extraordinary? When we talk about extraordinary claims, extraordinary to whom? Extraordinary how? You know, anomalous. Anomalous relevant to what theory? Anomalous to whom? Again, we don't go into that. It's all sort of magic words. Rationality. You know, what the hell do we mean by rationality? One of the great problems in this area for any social psychologist, and I'm still basically a social psychologist in sociology, is when is somebody rationalizing and when is somebody being rational? You know, if you like what they have to say, you think it's rational. If you think it's an illusion, you call it rationalization. So there's a lot of game playing in this area. And it's a tremendously complex business. And it has to do largely with the mental sets, the schemas that we bring in with us individually, or sometimes in small collectives, to what we're examining. It's a very old joke, and I'm not telling it to be funny, but I'm telling it just because it exemplifies what I'm saying, I hope. Many of you know the joke. The fellow goes to the doctor and he says, I have a problem. And he says, what? Well, I'm dead. And he says, you're dead? Yes, I'm dead. And the doctor says, well, do dead men bleed? And he says, of course dead men don't bleed. So the doctor takes a pin, sticks it in his hand, the blood oozes out, and the guy looks at his hand and says, gee, I guess dead men do bleed. And this problem of dissonance reduction and being able to change different parts of your mental framework to fit new facts is at the crux of the difficulty. It's not as if, you know, your facts will speak for themselves and one experiment's going to destroy the field or something like that. It doesn't work that way. Everything gets salvaged, you know, by sometimes extraordinary ways, sometimes very subtle, interesting ways. And of course, to make it worse, the philosophy of science has compounded all of this, because we have, some of you may know, the Duhem-Quine thesis, which basically argues that there isn't any one particular model, that there are almost infinite models that could cover the same data equally well, and so there's some question about basic fallibility in science and very fundamental questions about whether any one schema is better than another one anyway, in terms of the big picture. So we have lots and lots of problems in this area, and it gets more and more complex the more you get into it. As I have looked at the field, and I was among the true disbelievers for a very long time, and now I've sort of fallen much more often into the camp of the true believers. What I'm always amazed at is the similarity between the two extremes. And I've come to recognize that really the so-called, what I call nothing but-ism point of view, it's nothing but, whatever it is, exists on both sides. For some people, the consciousness is nothing but spirit. For the other side, consciousness is nothing but the brain and what the brain does, that sort of thing. I mean, everybody has these simplistic little explanations on both sides, and they reduce things down. And the hardest part for me is to try to make others realize that reasonable people can and do differ. And I would argue that they should be able to do it reasonably. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't unreasonable people, but you sort of have to start out with the idea that they're reasonable and hope they'll sort of expose their unreasonableness in the course of communication. Okay, one of the big things that I have centered on in so much of my work has really revolved around the two fundamental types of human errors. Statisticians call them type 1 and type 2 error, and you probably know the terminology, some of you do of that. But the fundamental errors are thinking something special is going on when it's not, as opposed to thinking nothing special is going on when it actually is. The folk sayings we have, knowing something that ain't so, as opposed to knowing something ain't so that it is. Not seeing the forest for the trees is a version of one, not seeing the trees for the forest is a version of the other. All that glitters is not gold is a proverb reflecting one. Throwing out the baby with the bathwater, I think, reflects the other. We have this constant polarity of extremism, potentially, that leading us to one kind of error or the other. And the most interesting thing, of course, is to what degree are they somewhat contradictory to each other, to what degree the surer you are of one, the more you lose of the other. My own pet theory, I'll just throw it out very quickly, is that when a science is young, and this is just Truzzi's theory, when a science is very, very young, and it's looking like hell to order the world and find generalizations and find laws and so on, when they're starting out, they don't want to make that type 1 error. They really don't want to think something special is going on when it's not. They want to sort of strip the field of magic and all kinds of things that are superstition and the rest. They want to come up with a theory that really, to them, explains at least most things as quickly as possible. After the theory gets very advanced, and science sort of fills in all the holes, I think, very, very nicely, then they start paying attention to type 2 error. In other words, when you have a theory of almost everything, like in physics, then you start to realize that the anomalous stuff is where the next Nobel Prize is going to be. Because what everybody's looking for is something that's going to overturn the model, because that's what's going to be truly revolutionary new now, because everybody sort of knows where they are at that stage. So physics can be, very concerned, as many are now, with type 2 errors and are taking into serious attention very anomalous things that don't seem to fit the current so-called theories of everything that are out there, or attemptedly theories of everything. Whereas poor psychology, we've never gotten the first rung. I mean, psychology is not established as a science, anything like physics, and they're still looking for laws. I mean, they haven't got any yet. So they are really concerned when somebody comes along with an anomaly to get them off there. They're the ones who want to sweep the Fortean phenomenon, the anomalies, under the rug, out of the way, and they'll say things like, oh, it's a mere anomaly. Mere anomaly. We don't have to worry about that. It's a mere anomaly, which is actually the response to Psi that one notable critic gave. So I think it's maybe as we grow up as a science, maybe we're going to start balancing between the two types of error more. But it's very important, though, for the purpose of psi research, I think. Related to this is, I think, sort of the so-called essential tension in science that Thomas Kuhn talked about. Science is supposed to be a conservative system, trying to hold on to the body of findings and generalizations, of course. One would expect it to be conservative. At the same time, it's got to be an open system. The door has to be always cracked open a little bit for new stuff to come in so that it's an open system and can change. So we have this problem of the balance of the essential tension, as he called it. And so we have these tendency to sometimes be, on the one end, dogmatic. The people who are really concerned about type 1 error tend more likely to be more dogmatic. The people who are more concerned about type 2 error are probably going to be labeled credulous or gullible or something of that kind, because they're too quick to see payoffs maybe in these maverick areas. My own view is that obviously you need to avoid both types of errors to philosophize and ultimately to do proper science. You have to keep the essential tension. It's not easy to do that. And probably Aristotle's golden mean, moderation in all things, is probably the best tack to take. Just, recognize that science really is swimming in a sea of ignorance, and basically we have little floating around hypotheses and so-called evidence and so-called proofs, and we do the best we can with what we got, and that's about it. And hopefully it'll get better. Okay, could you put on the second? Basically what I've done is I've taken the outline that you have in your abstract, in your my abstract of my talk, and I've just done it sort of sentence by sentence on these next two slides. And I'm just going to sort of try to comment on each thing as I go along, and hopefully it won't be too disorganized, and at least you'll get what you sort of paid for in terms of these topics. First of all, what is skepticism? What are its varieties? At the outset, I think we have to recognize, again, abuse of terminology, terrible abuse of terminology. A skeptic is a doubter. He's not a denier. He or she is not a denier. Everyone seems to be confusing that on the one side. I think many people call themselves skeptics who are pseudo-skeptics. They are more properly what I would call scoffers. I much prefer to talk about skeptics and scoffers. I notice it's become very popular in paranormal circles to often speak of the enemy, as it were, the opposition, as cynics. That's the wrong term, folks. I mean, philosophically, that makes it even worse, because cynics are a totally separate school of philosophy. You're not necessarily a pessimist about human nature, if you don't believe in psi. I mean, that's not what it means. I just would wish we could use the terms properly as skeptic and pseudo-skeptic, if that's what we mean. Or perhaps we should just get rid of the word skeptic altogether, just because it's become such quicksand. I started using the term zetetic for that reason some years ago. It caught on a little bit, but not very much, because it represents a philosophical skepticism that's somewhat closer to my meaning. We also need to remember that the scoffers, the dogmatic folks particularly, are on not just the scientific side of the fence, they're also on the theological, religious side of the fence. We have to remember that much of the opposition, especially to psi and related matters, has come not necessarily from science, but from orthodoxy of a theological sort. I mean, spiritualism was primarily attacked for not being spiritual by the religionists. Most of the major scientists of the day were involved in early spiritualism and psychical research. It's only lately that we've sort of come to misperceive spiritualism as magical, etc. It wasn't the way it was perceived then. Okay. Now, when we talk about skeptics and skeptical groups and so on, we need to, I think, make some differentiations. First of all, there are public skeptic groups. I guess that's what I call them, the public skeptics. These are people who take the mantle of skepticism. The Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, certainly the major one, although they're being given a good run for their money by the Skeptic Society that Michael Shermer started up in Los Angeles, which is an independent group and seems to really be growing very rapidly and creating almost a schism within the so-called skeptical movement. Most of the people in the so-called skeptical movement, like Psychop and the Skeptic Society, not all, but most, I think, probably tend towards being scoffers rather than skeptics, in my view, and that's where my difficulty with so many of them comes. But you have to realize that skepticism, is something that you can be very skeptical on one issue, but not on another. I mean, there are a lot of parapsychologists who are enormously cynical, if you want to call it that, about macro PK, for example. They may believe in telepathy, but they think macro PK is just nonsense, mumbo jumbo. So, you can be skeptical about UFOs while being total believer in TM or something. I mean, we shouldn't assume it all goes together. It doesn't. Although there's probably some tendency towards some kinds of correlations in there. Now, first of all, I shall also mention, of course, JREF, the James Randi Educational Foundation, and what I call, and what Ray Hyman has called, hitmen. There are people that the scientific community sometimes seems to reward for taking on the mavericks, sort of the good, reputable mainstream scientists don't want to contaminate themselves by getting involved with the kooks as they see them, and so they welcome people like Randy and others who will come forward and sort of do the dirty work. Unfortunately, they're not always, I think, fair or really informed about what they're doing, but it doesn't really matter because they're hitmen. I mean, the whole idea is, as Ray Hyman put it, is to discredit, not to actually disprove, which is very important. Now, of course, the varieties of skepticism, there's philosophical skepticism, which, of course, again, most of the people who call themselves skeptics don't even know what that means. I mean, really, they don't at all. They equate rationalism, for example, with empiricism, because they think that's what science is all about. And they don't realize that rationalism and empiricism were two different traditions fighting each other for many centuries. I mean, they're so... The ignorance in some ways in philosophical area is amazing among the skeptics, I think, many of them. There's, of course, just simple psychological skepticism. I mean, some people are just stubborn. Show me, I'm from Missouri. You know, that to me is not, you know, being a skeptic in any important, grandiose way. It's just, you know, somebody who's disinclined to buy your story. Then there's scientific skepticism, and here's where our problem comes in. Skepticism is a norm in science. It is part of the normal working operation of science for people in science to profess to be scientists to do things skeptically. We're supposed to question anybody's claim who comes forward. And that doesn't mean unorthodox claims, it means orthodox claims. All claims in science are supposed to be amenable to investigation, inquiry, and so on. In other words, that's just the way science is supposed to operate according to most of the people who, you know, sort of put forward the games of the rule. The problem is that the people who call themselves skeptics don't seem to realize this very often. Many of the skeptics think it's okay to be skeptical towards unorthodox ideas, but they don't want to be skeptical toward orthodox ideas. So they'll criticize fortune tellers, but they'll never compare them to psychiatrists. Okay, this is the problem. There's a sort of a tendency to sort of, you know, accept allopathic medicine while rejecting alternative approaches and so on. And it's kind of incredible when you think about it. I mean, sometimes I think it's astonishing that so many of these people get so heated up about what I think are such trivial societal issues. I mean, my God, we have genocide in the world, we have horrible things going on all over the place, and these people get all, you know, tied in knots about some little fortune teller on a tabloid talk show somewhere. I mean, that nobody else endorses anyway. I mean, I just think it's incredible. I read the Skeptical Inquirer sometimes, and I feel it should be called the National Skeptical Inquirer, because it's kind of on the same level sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. Okay. But scientific skepticism is supposed to be a multi-edged sword. We're supposed to be skeptical towards everything, and we should realize that there's terrific variation of skepticism in the various sciences. So biology is far more open to psi, let's say, than psychology. I suppose meteorologists probably don't give much of a damn one way or another, scientifically speaking. Although that's not entirely true. We've been doing stuff on weather and psi, so I guess they could get into the game somewhere. But the thing is, we need to realize that we're talking about very elaborate communities out there, variegated communities, and we shouldn't, you know, they shouldn't talk about psi believers, you know, in a big mass any more than we should talk about all skeptics in a big mass, because there's a terrific variety. Now, looking down the list here of things, belief versus knowledge and the question of non-scientific versus scientific knowledge. Now, I happen to personally, philosophically, be totally committed to scientific knowledge, but there's certainly no reason in the world any of you should be, nor would I expect you to be. That has to do with one's own views about ontology and epistemology and lots of other questions. But the fact is that you know, belief is normally distinguished from knowledge, which is justified belief. And there are lots of different ways to justify belief to different people and through the ages. I happen to not buy some versions of that. If you tell me you justify your belief because you talked to Gabriel last night, you know, winged figure or something, I'm probably going to be skeptical towards what you say. On the other hand, you know, I have to recognize that people have transcendent experiences, etc. And William James and other radical empiricists are certainly right, in my view, in recognizing that even as a scientist, we have to sort of accept all human experience, whatever it is, and as part of our data, and go from there. But there's a lot of non-scientific, in terms of contemporary thinking, knowledge. I mean, just two obvious ones: aesthetics, ethics. I don't consider those scientific knowledge areas myself. Many scientists that I know, many critics, certainly skeptics, don't see science as giving us ethics or aesthetics. So obviously there is non-scientific stuff out there, and I don't think most of these people would just call it nonsense anymore, like the logical positivists. They would probably think it's just non-scientific knowledge. Must all beliefs be justified anyway? I kind of doubt it. I mean, life is full of all kinds of beliefs we all have. I strongly have beliefs that are much more important to me than my knowledge, scientific knowledge. You know, I believe my family loves me. I think my dog will welcome me home when I come home. All kinds of things that are very important to me, probably. And much more important than E equals MC squared, probably. In terms of how I feel about it, and that's normal. I mean, there are all kinds of beliefs that we don't necessarily want to justify. There's also the question of whether a lot of false beliefs might be useful. I sometimes feel that the critics may be in big trouble, because if you deny a placebo effect, then, or if you, then how in the world are you going to have one? It seems to me that they may wish, if they ever get to the pearly gates or something, that they had believed, because they would have at least had a chance to have a mind-body effect or something. Certainly, we have a lot of psychologists working on so-called positive illusions. There's a new book that just came out on self-deception and the advantages and positive functions of self-deception. Certainly, if you take the radical scientific view, in which we're a meaningless planet with meaningless people, spinning around just through evolution, et cetera, which may be true, that's a pretty horrible state of affair. I mean, many people find that very upsetting and bleak, and who wants to live with that? For most people, I think. And so, maybe objectivity is not the full name of the game, but justification may not be the full name of the game at all. The issue of subjective versus objective validation is extremely important. This is especially true in remote viewing, where we see a tremendous amount of subjective validation going on, and very questionable instances of objective validation, at least when we see it. It seems to be pretty infrequent lately. The scientific rules of the game are simply some rules that we, I think, need to specify, and we usually do as the so-called scientific method. And key elements are falsifiability, replication, and parsimony. And I wanted to at least make a comment on those particular three things. Falsifiability, ever since Karl Popper especially, has become a major rule for us. We have to be able to say what will prove us wrong. So if you want to make a scientific claim about remote viewing, you should be willing to say what it would take to show you didn't really have it. Okay? If you can't say that, if you're not willing to conceptually come up with some scenario that would make you say it was a mistake, you can't make a scientific claim about it. That's all. I mean, it doesn't mean it's not true. I'm not arguing philosophically, but scientifically speaking, any scientist has to be willing to say what it would take to show him he was wrong. If you can't do that, you just don't belong in the ballpark in that particular game. Replication, of course, is a complex matter. It's another good term that is used a lot by critics, and yet there are lots of different kinds of replication. If you look at the literature on replication, there are terrific problems there, and of course some sciences don't involve replication. Astronomy doesn't usually involve replication, and so on. Parsimony is probably the most difficult term. Some of you may know parsimony as Occam's razor, the basic idea being that the simplest adequate theory is the one we should accept in science. So if you can explain things just as the brain does everything that we talk about in mind, that would be the simpler explanation. The problem, of course, is that most of the critics particularly like to talk about it being simpler. That's fine. I'll usually agree with them that their explanation is simpler. Could be simple-minded too, but it's simpler. On the other hand, is it adequate? And that's where many of you would certainly disagree. It may account for some things, but it's not covering enough. That's the problem. So much of the debate is really around the full meaning of that word parsimony. Proper role of skepticism in science, I think I already mentioned that it's a basic norm. It needs to be two-edged at least in its application. Science is conservative. Oh, the principle of Laplace and the principle of Hamlet are two other designations that have been used related to type 1 and type 2 error. The principle of Laplace, many of you know as extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Regretfully, I coined that particular wording. Carl Sagan picked it up, and now it's everywhere, usually attributed to him. But in a way, I don't mind, because there are problems with that terminology. But on the one side, science is conservative, and extraordinary claims do indeed require some sort of commensurate proof. In other words, if you say you saw Christopher last night, and I say, that's nice, you saw Christopher last night, I'll accept that. Then you say, yes, it was Christopher Columbus, Then I start saying, whoa, how do I know you spoke or saw Christopher Columbus last night? You start demanding a hell of a lot more evidence, because the claim is obviously more outrageous, for someone who should have been dead 400 years and so on. That Christopher Columbus, in case I didn't say. And so the principle of Laplace, which is one of the early statements of this is in Laplace, argues this very conservative character that you really don't want to make that type 1 error. But the principle of Hamlet is, of course, the famous quotation of there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, that are dreamed of in your philosophy. That's the problem. I mean, there may be anomalies out there. There may be parts that we haven't taken into our schemes yet. And so constantly there's this fight between the principle of Laplace, the principle of Hamlet. Now, one of the things that's most interesting to me is that most of the people I know in parapsychological research find that the principle of Hamlet is what's important, that they don't want to make a type 2 error. And the reason is usually because they think if psi were true, if it were true, it would be so incredibly important. In other words, it's not just for psychology. It has to do with spiritual, many other values. You know, they think philosophically it's something you don't want to make a mistake in denying prematurely. So, you know, we sort of come at these things from different ends sometimes. I mentioned the need to avoid type 1 and type 2. Oh, the other distinction here, non-proof versus disproof and issues of strength of evidence. Most critics, I think, really don't understand these distinctions. It's a basic logical distinction. It's made all the time. In Scottish law, we see it where we have not proven as a category of finding for a defendant. A person can be guilty, not guilty, or not proved. I believe it's proved there, not proven. And in this case, when you do an attempt to find psi and the evidence doesn't come out right, it doesn't come out positively, most critics will tend to say, we just disproved psi, whereas the proponent will say, no, we just didn't show up that day. You know, it's just non-proof. It's just, we're right back where we started. Okay. My view as a skeptic is by and large to tell most parapsychologists that their case is non-proved to me. Okay. And so I'm always willing to say, come back when you have stronger stuff, that's all. I don't call you a liar or a fraud or anything like that. I just say, you haven't convinced me, that's all. And that usually goes over much better than Randy's approach of you're an idiot, you're a fraud, etc. The other issue here is strength of evidence. You know, we have to realize that evidence is always a matter of degree. The worst thing that critics do, in my opinion, one of the cardinal sins, is they are always saying things like, there is no evidence for psi. There is no evidence for homeopathy. There is no, you know, they're always saying that. Or often no scientific evidence, and sometimes it'll be a little nicer like that. But of course that's ridiculous. There's always evidence. Anecdotal evidence is evidence. It's not very weighted evidence. It's not very, you know, convincing evidence to many of us, but it's evidence, damn it. In fact, we wouldn't even have many clinical areas of science. We wouldn't have so many areas of science if we didn't have anecdotal evidence. Anthropology would be pretty much out the window, you know, so on. So we have to recognize that there are problems of strength of evidence. I think we'd get along much better, we skeptics and you proponents, if we just, you know, forthrightly made it clear that we're not saying there's no evidence. We just don't find it enough yet, you know, and encourage you to get more if you can, that's all. And then, of course, we have the issues of placement and weight of the burden of proof. The placement in science of proof, burden of proof, is always on the claimant. I mean, it's as simple as that. When you make the claim, you're trying to get the skeptics to change their mind, or at least in this case, the main body of orthodox science. If you don't want to bother to do that, that's fine. But, you know, if you're trying to play the game with them, you sort of have to accept that that's the burden of proof on you. The weight of burden is on you. Too many players don't seem to realize that. They get upset about that. The next slide, please. I'll try to finish up here. Now, the second part of this deals with the anomalous character of psi claims and questions raised as to evidence and burden of proof within this scientific game. One of the first questions for me is, why is psi conceptually defined positively but operationally defined negatively? This has always troubled me, and I think this is where the skeptics win sort of with a sort of stacked deck in some ways. When we talk about people who believe in psi, they talk about psi. They, you know, and most folk like myself, using the word in everyday language, you know, we mean something positive about it. We think that's the way people see things. They, you know, they cognitively or perceptually get information and so on. I mean, it's a very positive outlook. It's just like saying I smelled something or saw something. You know, I intuited something. I mean, that's a rather positive process. Okay. For the skeptic, of course, the hardline skeptic especially, we'd operationally define it. We have to eliminate every possible thing it could be, and the residue, the leftover stuff in the experiment. If we can't account for it by cheating, we can't account for it by all kinds of mistakes and errors, then what's left over, this residuum, that's psi, which is bizarre when you think about it. Now, it's very sad, because what started out as really significant experiential stuff, some woman having an intuitive experience that her child is drowning and she goes and saves the child, or some anecdote like that, and you're really impressed by that. You think, wow, that's saved a child, that's great stuff. I'd like to know more about that. And next thing you know, it's in the laboratory and somebody's guessing at cards, and then they're getting statistical significance in a number of cards over others, and they don't even know which ones are right or wrong anyway, but they're getting some more right than wrong, and it seems to be within some range that's acceptable, and then they come out with these results, and then of course the critics say, yes, but did you control for X, Y, Z, etc., and they go back and forth, and they finally come up with a new experiment. They control everything they possibly can, and then the experiment is presented to the critics, and the critic says, well, look at it. All you got is this little bitty statistically significant thing here, and it's a mere anomaly. Mere anomaly. What started out as this wonderful big spiritual thing that was a wonderful major part of human existence, and with implications everywhere, it sort of gets reduced to this little operational negative finding. And so I feel sorry for people in the field, because I can sort of see the loss, that they must feel when they see this happen. So especially when you finally seem to prove the anomaly is there, like I think Ed May and many others probably should have had a better reception to their work, with what they thought they proved. And people just say, well, that's very interesting. Just another anomaly in science. Science is full of anomalies. We don't have to worry about this one anymore, because so they sort of paint you into the corner and then seal you off. Does remote viewing really mean clairvoyance rather than psi? This is a real problem for me as I deal with people at conferences like this one. It started out, remote viewing was introduced by, I guess, Targan Puthoff. It sounded good. I don't know what their full motives were. I haven't really talked that much about them. But, it sounds a lot like remote sensing, which was being done by satellites, and that's engineering talk, remote sensing. So, that sounds hardware, science. These were physicists. At first, they seemed not to want to have much to do with the parapsychological community, which was initially a little resented by the parapsychologists, who thought they were following the Columbus complex and coming up with new stuff, unnecessarily new, labeled new. And so, the next thing you know, we have this thing called remote viewing. And as far as I can tell, and in the minds of the more hardline RV experimenters, RV is a protocol. RV is not just clairvoyance. RV is a way of having judgments over multiple targets and so on, and coming up with this methodological way of establishing what you've got with free choice targets and so on. That's what RV was supposed to mean. That was what was innovative, and that's why it was not just another ESP experiment, as far as I can see. And I think it was very important. Now that we started selling remote viewing and giving courses in it and everything else without, I think, adequate scientific foundation in so many ways, now everybody's starting to just talk about it as another word for clairvoyance. People are talking about psychometry and everything else related to RV, and that's not what RV was. Not to those of us who are asked to take it seriously. They sort of moved the goalposts, not forward, but back, in a sense, to me. And I expect them almost to start talking about sixth senses next, especially with the popularity of the movie. So is remote viewing the viewing, psi, which could be clairvoyance or whatever you want to call it, or is it the protocol, the whole package? And we, of course, have debates within the RV community about that. How strong is the scientific case for psi? Obviously, I think reasonable people can differ. I'm troubled by people on the proponent side who say that any right-minded, clear-thinking scientist who examines the data must conclude that psi is real. I think that's going too far. On the other hand, I think the critics are saying there's absolutely no scientific evidence for psi over 150 years of investigation. That's going way too far the other way. So this should be a middle. I think now than it was, but part of the problem is that every time we find what may be a helpful answer, like meta-analysis, usually the critics will come in and start questioning that method too. So meta-analysis is now being dismissed by a lot of people just because parapsychology is using it, even though they used it in medicine before successfully, we thought. How parsimonious is psi? Well, again, to what degree is it necessary? I really wonder. It seems to me that we know the world is full of unknown things, but unknown things include unknown sources of error, not necessarily unknown positive things. If we look at the history of science, people are always discovering something was thought to be true because of some methodological fluke or something. Maybe statistics are all wrong. Maybe our assumptions statistically are just quite wrong about what normalcy is and what distribution should be there normally and so on. I don't know what it is that's producing the results, but it does seem to me that real issues can be raised about whether psi as a term really tells us much, because we don't really have much in the way of a theory of psi in a scientific sense, and so just saying it's psi is always a problem for me. I mean, I remember talking to Scott Rogo years ago, and we were talking about poltergeists, and Scott was one of these guys I was very funny. We mentioned this poltergeist, and he said, "Oh, that's not a poltergeist. That's not spirits. That's merely PK, merely PK." The adolescent troubled girl is producing this PK stuff. Merely PK. Yeah. So he was explaining one unknown by another unknown. We don't know what the hell PK is either. That's the problem. When we keep finding ourselves, and the same thing is true of the critics. They do this all the time. Somebody gets healed, and you say, "Oh, it's just a mere placebo. It's a mere remission effect." We have no idea what really makes placebos. We have no idea what the hell is a remission and what produces them. I mean, we have some ideas, but it's just explaining one unknown by another unknown, one label by another label. It's absolutely astonishing. People really don't pay attention to what parsimony really means. Is psi replicable? Well, then we get into a question of what we mean by replicability. Certainly, the skeptics mean replicable by skeptics. They mean people who are non-believers getting into the picture. Are the critics playing fair? Well, I think I pretty much indicated that a lot of them probably are not. And I should mention, in all fairness, critics do criticize each other, not nearly as often as proponents do. I found that the best criticism of parapsychology is within parapsychology. But I have to, say Ray Hyman has criticized Hansel and other critics in the past. I think they try to play fair, but I don't know that they succeed. Is the case against psi non-falsifiable? That's an interesting question. The critics always like to ask, is the case for psi non-falsifiable? In other words, would the proponents of psi always find an excuse for failure? Would you always find a reason why it just didn't show up that day? He was nervous, he was psi missing, catch-22 as Martin Gardner used to call it. But the other question needs to be asked, is the case against psi non-falsifiable? What will the critics take to get rid of their negative position? What could you show a critic that they would accept? They have to tell you that too. They should be able to tell you that if they're playing fairly. The three routes to scientific acceptance of anomaly claims, I think Rao first pointed this out. Replication, of course, finding repeated studies of the same thing coming up over and over again, especially by skeptics and non-believers. Theory expansion is enormously important. If you can somehow change our view of the schema, change our view of the world so that psi is less extraordinary, so that psi is no longer so anomalous as it once was. If we can make it more reasonable to believe and more plausible to think psi could be out there, well, then we're not going to expect as much evidence for psi because it's not as extraordinary a claim anymore. There certainly have been attempts in physics lately to start talking about theory expansion, although none of them have gained really a lot of ground, I think, really in the normal orthodox community. And finally, application. You can run an end run around the whole game. You can go out and start winning on the stock market with ESP. You can start curing people's diseases or something, making them healthier. You can find missing children, whatever, right? You can just just say, the hell with you, scientists. I'll show you it works in the real world pragmatically through application. That's worked for some things. Anesthetics is supposed to be a major example. I remember Michael Crichton talked to the Parapsychological Association one year about that. Apparently there's still no fully accepted theory of anesthetics, but nobody's going to throw it away. We have a similar problem with acupuncture. We don't have a real explanation for acupuncture reducing pain, yet I think the medical community is very rapidly coming around to accept that it does. Old ideas like placebo effects and suggestibility, I think, have real problems when you do veterinary acupuncture. unless you have a lot more imagination in those cows than I thought they had, which is possible. If the dead can bleed, cows can think. I don't know. But right now, most of us would be inclined to think that application may be the way. Many of you are going after application with RV especially, and I think that's probably a bit tragic because unless the application is done under very well-controlled circumstances so that, critical business people even, would, or police departments, whoever else, accept what you're saying, you don't really have the proofs. I mean, I see a lot of talk at this meeting in the past, last year's meeting, and about helping the police and one thing or another, but I don't see the police giving those talks. Okay? That's what bothers me. Okay? I hear psychics telling me about how much help they were to police, but they're not showing me letters from police departments. And as you may know, Arthur Lyons and I did a book on psychics and crime, and we simply did not get the kind of endorsements that people have been claiming, shown to us anyway. How does remote viewing fare in each of these areas? Well, replication started out doing real well. Now there's just not a lot of work being done. Certainly no great attempt was made to get the critics to do much. Ray Hyman joined Jeffrey Mishlove in one experiment, and that was about it. Most of the people doing the work are proponents, or so much of it is buried in secrecy, and now, before they would hide behind security restrictions of the government, now people are saying, well, the corporation I'm working for, this is privileged information, we can't tell you, I'd have to get permission from the company to share this data with you. And this is all doing science in the closet, and who the hell knows what's going on in there. I mean, scientifically, it could be interesting, but it's not a great step forward. Theory expansion, I don't see, except for Ed May, doing much on theory expansion on remote viewing. People like Ingo Swann and others are always writing these tracts about the bio-mind and one thing or another, but I don't think that a serious scientific effort. This is more philosophical than anything else. And then application, again, as I said, I wish we had more systematic application. Lynn Buchanan, I think, is trying to move in that direction. At this point, it's just not convincing to me. How does remote viewing fare in each of these areas? I said, has Gresham's law hit remote viewing? Gresham's law, of course, is that the bad tends to drive out the good. I'm afraid that may be happening. I see a lot of interest in becoming a remote viewer, buying tapes on being a remote viewer, seeing movies on being a remote viewer, watching them on television, etc. I don't see any kind of funding really coming forth, in a serious way to support research in remote viewing, and I think that's very sad. So I think Gresham's law may be hitting remote viewing. It's not an accident, I don't think, that some principal proponents of remote viewing are not here today. And how can we move psi research from the level of merely often suggestive and sometimes compelling to what might be consistently convincing? Again, this is an issue. This distinction I make is very important to me. We have to recognize that arguments being given for things are not necessarily just good or bad. I mean, like they proved it or they disproved it. Things are not that simple in science. What we have are levels of proof. Just like a weight of evidence in the courtroom, you have weight of evidence in science. And clearly, some people come forward with something, maybe it's an anecdote, maybe it's something sloppily done, but it's certainly suggestive, wow, you read it and you say, it seems to be true, and there weren't controls, there weren't a lot of things I wish were there, but, that encourages me to look into the matter, I'm interested now and I will pursue it further. And that's great. Then there are things that are compelling, which to me means that someone who's a critic would look at it and say, gee, I can't account for that any other way. It sure as hell looks like you've done it the right way. It sure as hell looks good to me in terms of what I can tell from this limited information I have, one study, one description, etc. And I would find that compelling. My own feeling towards remote viewing, a little less so in recent years, but initially was that I would see it as definitely compelling. I believe research needs to be supported in the area. It's not convincing to me yet, but it's certainly serious work, okay? And more needs to be done. And I would try to persuade others to do that. But the final level of convincing is really the argument that any reasonable scientist who looks at the data, who looks at the sum of work, would probably come away saying, looks true, looks good. It's not just compelling. It seems, as far in terms of the best knowledge I now have, this seems to be true. Okay? We have not gotten to convincing. the people that I know in parapsychology that I represent, what's the word? Respect most. Maybe it's because they agree with me. I hope not. But they're the people I consider the hardline researchers, Ryan Center and so on. They take this position too. It's not convincing yet. They recognize that the scientific community is not just pig-headed and obstinate and stupid. That really we haven't done enough to really convince them yet. Okay, but we should have by now been able to make them admit it's compelling, and that's where the critics have gone too far. They want to deny, many of them, even that it's suggestive, which I think is just being pig-headed. That's it. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Paul, I don't think, do you want to take any questions or anything, or should we stop? Because I know you're trying to get going here. Right? Should I get off and get next one? Or? There may not be any. I just thought, Yeah.
If your goal is to achieve a balance between type 1 and type 2, why call it skepticism? Why not just call it critical thinking?
Well, I believe that real skepticism is part of real critical thinking and real science. I mean, it is one of the norms of science. I think separating it off is a sort of, as if it's something like there are skeptical scientists and non-skeptical scientists or something is ridiculous. I mean, it's a contradiction. A non-skeptical scientist to me is an oxymoron. It just doesn't make sense. But they have chosen to use that terminology. See, my problem is that the skeptics have come up with the language to talk about skepticism, and the proponents have bought into it. You guys all refer to these pseudo-skeptics as skeptics. You accept their own label for themselves. See, they pretend to be agnostics. They pretend to be neutral. We're open-minded. We're neutral. They just haven't convinced us. Kind of attitude. The reality is they're not open-minded because they have a negative position. And if they have a negative position, they have to produce research to prove the negative position. If I say to you, well, somebody could have cheated in this experiment. It's true, somebody could have cheated in the experiment. And it certainly reduces the value of the evidence for the experiment if I can reasonably show you he had a chance to look over the transom or something. Okay. But that's not proof of fraud. Just like in law. If they assert not that it could have happened, but that it did happen, it must have happened, then they've got to produce some evidence of that. And they, of course, don't do that because they act like they have no burden of proof. They say, we're the skeptics, we have no burden of proof. A true skeptic has no burden of proof because he's in the middle. A pseudo-skeptic has a burden of proof. He's a denier. He's asserting the negative. And so they've avoided having to become full players in the game. And so I have to sort of use the labels whether I like it or not because they use them. And, so do many of you. Surely. Not in the sense that you probably mean. I haven't done full-fledged experimentation that I've directed. I've been a subject in a few things. I guess, well, like last year's at the RV thing, I brought the targets, something like that, which I picked and so on. So I've certainly been involved. More important, I've been talking to the researchers in the area for about 30 years now, from pretty much from the beginning. And but like they say, you don't have to be a chicken to know an egg. Well, I'm very impressed by the pair work, but the question was, what did I think of the pair work, Dr. Robert John and the Princeton work at Pair? I'm impressed by it, as it exists, but where's the replication? I mean, it's not his fault that other people haven't replicated. I mean, you can't expect him to fund other laboratories. But, to me, the history of science is full of, unfortunately, really is full of mere anomalies. It is full of reports. In fact, from my point of view, people in the game of proposing anomalies should welcome replication. You see, the proper attitude of the scientist, when you come up with something wild and woolly that seems off the wall or strange, outrageous to me, perhaps as a critic, the fact that I demand replication really kind of clears you, because what it allows me to do is say, well, you may be right, but I'd like to have a second opinion. I mean, like you do to a physician, maybe. You don't go to your first physician and say, you're an idiot, you're a fraud, you're a liar, you must be mistaken. You know, you don't do that. You just say, well, I will get me some other opinions. And if you find the other opinions don't agree with the first guy, you don't necessarily go back and sue the first guy for malpractice or something. You just say, thank you very much, and you take what you think are the better opinions. And that's the way science should work. And we shouldn't be name-calling. We should be doing more research. So, I mean, I view a lot of this sort of the need for replication as kind of something good for subjects, good for proponents. Just as I would tell a subject, look, we want these controls not because I don't trust you, not because I think you're a fraud, but I want controls because I'm your friend and I want to protect you against the Randys and the nasty guys who will say you cheated. And so the only way to help you is by being your best lawyer, and that means putting your very best case together for you. And, you know, a good psychic should welcome a really helpful, highly critical thinking experimenter, as long as he's not, you know, the enemy. Yeah. I'm sorry. He's been waving there.
How would you categorize Michael Shermer?
Michael started out much more involved in critical thinking than in debunking. He was largely concerned with, I think, a lot of bigger issues like creation science, the Holocaust deniers, and many other things which perhaps belong in the bailiwick. In recent years, however, he has gone in the Randy direction. In some ways, Shermer is as bad as Randy, in my view now, about a lot of things. Maybe it's Randy's influence, maybe it's not, I don't know. But he started out in the journal saying, I'm not going to ridicule, we're not going to do various things as part of his editorial statement. And if you've watched him on television, on the show he's been on the Learning Channel, no, Fox Family Channel, excuse me, you know, he clearly ridicules people. And in fact, he had a column recently, it was awful satire of psych. I mean, it was very nasty. So, you know, I feel he's sort of becoming a scoffer. And it's a shame, because I saw him as the hope against Psychop. I mean, I thought more reasonable voice was there.